years?
He's been writing for 4. Yeah, because when I been writing for 4 and
Where's most comfortable?
I took over. Yeah.
I think it was,
It seems like, you know, just last year.
It goes by fast. Yeah, because I took over a couple of his clients. And he was like, yeah, I can just, these ones are taking it around. And sometimes I try to but I was like, okay,
Hey guys, it's about 2 o'clock. So we'll get this started. Good afternoon, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the CAAAC Advisory Meeting. And thanks for coming out and joining us either in person or on the phone or via link. We've got a couple different ways that we're streaming this YouTube. Again, one thing we want to, this is totally interactive, we want comment, we want questions, so feel free during the whole presentation to stop us and ask questions if you have or provide any sort of comment you might have. A couple of logistics real fast, if you are in person, there was a sign-in by the door, so please sign in. And also, in the room, the mics are hot, they are live mics. And please speak into the mic when you do have a question or a comment, so that the people are streaming or on the phone can hear us. And if you are on watching via Skype link, please go ahead and there's a chat box. You can go ahead and insert your comment there, and we're watching this. And so introductions, I'm Liz Ulrich. I am the supervisor of the Analysis and Planning Services section in the Air Quality Bureau. Rebecca Harvard is also her speaking, part of the Analysis Planning Services section. Dave Clamp, Bureau Chief, and Kristen Martin, meteorologist, are from TU and will be presenting today. So there's a couple of introductions, and I'll let them say more if they'd like to. Sorry about that. So but let's go ahead and go on the phone and do introductions. So if you're on the phone, would you mind saying maybe your name and who you're with?
Peggy Trench with Treasure State Resources Association.
Thanks, Peggy.
Beth Steinmetz with Northwestern Energy.
This is Dwayne Mitchell from Richland County.
Greg Gannon with Trident.
Shadow Brenner with the EPA in Denver.
Joe Lero with ExxonMobil in Billings.
Corey Zettner with MDU in Sydney.
Okay, and I think we might have some of our satellite offices that have also called in just to listen. Rebecca's doing regional Haze later on, and so we'd like to have them, if they wanted to participate, they could call in and view it also. And then let's go ahead and go around the room and do some introductions.
I'm Trevor Graff with Legislative Services.
Debbie Skibisky, Bison Engineering.
Jim Parker, Talon Energy.
Alan Olson, Montana Petroleum Association.
Gary Forrester, MDU Resources.
Kristen Martin, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. David Clump, Air Quality Bureau.
And Rebecca Harbage with the Air Quality Bureau. All right, so is that everybody that's attending? That's everybody on the call? Okay. So the first part, we're just kind of gonna buzz through some updates pretty quickly. Here we go. So here's our agenda. The first half is going to be pretty quick, and then we'll give most of our time to Rebecca and Regional Haze. So with the first part, last meeting we asked for some feedback. If people had comments or wanted to hear something, please let us know. And we actually had somebody submit something that they were interested in, and that was about our Air Quality Bureau budget and funding. So we'll have Dave Klemp come up and talk to us about that.
I do. again, thank you everybody for attending. Those of you who traveled long distances, we very much appreciate it. Those who took the time to call in, equally is appreciative of that. This is very timely, so thank you for asking for this budget update. Budget is something that we need to keep front and center always. Without money, we're not able to do a lot of the things that we are asked to do. The timeliness also with the new board appointees that I know we're going to talk about here in a little bit. We will have a board meeting in September, and by statute or by rule, we are required to update the board every September on the status of our air quality fees. We don't like to do anything in front of the board without first doing it in front of our Clean Air Act Advisory Council Committee. So it's really important from that perspective that we talk through a lot of this stuff with all of you. Budget has also been something that we've been working on very hard in the Air Quality Bureau for as long as I've been a bureau chief, and even before that with the previous bureau chief. So for the last 10 years or so, budget's been a very important issue, and it's going to be increasingly important in the next 3 to 5 years as well. So what we have here is a slide, and this is the only slide we have for this, and we have a pie chart that is reflective of our actual funding. This is not based on our appropriation. So when we look at air fees at 71.5%, that is based on what we actually collect for revenue. Now, the federal portion of that, I believe it is based on the because our appropriation matches, generally speaking, what we get from the feds. So they're one and the same. That is the case for the general fund, which is the smaller percentage. We don't get a lot of general fund. The reason I bring that up is that if we were to actually look at this chart on the far right-hand corner, the red star, the $4.5 million, that is reflective of our fee appropriation. So if we were to fold in the fee appropriation into this chart, air fees would be greater than 80% of the overall funding portion of that. Why is that important? Well, air fees are something, the way we assess our fees is based on emissions. Emissions have been declining through the years, which is a good thing. Emissions have gone down, but it also means our funds can potentially go down as well. It's also reflective of, or it's indicative of that we are not a program that has a lot of general fund. We are a program that benefits a lot of the general population, and so this committee, through Don Allen and Dave Galt, and I imagine it's also near and dear to a lot of folks' heart here, is we have been trying to increase the other portions of this pie, aside from the fees, the state special fees. So we've been trying to get some additional general fund. And that's prompted, I think, this question about how we are budget-wise, because there are some economic indicators in the state. Some of those indicators, I don't know what the right terminology is, were not met. And so there were some corresponding cuts that were needed to be made across state government. Now, as a bureau, because we have such a small portion of general fund, we were not as significantly impacted as some of the other parts of this agency or other agencies that tend to get more general fund. We get roughly $150,000 per year in general fund. It would be good if we could get more, but we all know that the status of the general fund. Part of that is the natural resource operations. That is the coal and oil taxes and production and whatnot are down a little bit. And so there are, across the state, I think some of the general fund projections were not meeting the targets that were anticipated during the legislative session. The other part is the federal. That's the federal grant. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the president's skinny budget that was put out, roughly 30% across the board cut, at least was proposed from the president across some of the grants that we receive. At the same time, there was a lot of talk about cooperative federalism, transferring a lot of the authorities and responsibilities to states, but yet not with commensurate funding. I'll probably misspeak a little bit, but I think some of the recent budget things that have been released from Congress have restored some of those categorical grants to previous year levels. So at this point in time, we're hoping that we don't get any cuts to our federal grants, that at least it's a status quo. That would be a good thing. But what I want to highlight is that the federal grants have not kept pace. And so it is something that status quo is not keeping pace with some of the requirements that are coming out. So through our national associations, some of our regional associations, we are seeking additional federal revenues to implement some of these air quality programs instead of having to come back to some of the traditional fee payers. Now that's what I want to camp on for a little bit, because that's something that we've really been trying to be diligent on, is air quality fees. In 2009, we worked through this group to get some additional resources, some decision packages that were supported by members of CAAAC who actually testified in front of the budget subcommittee. And that took our fees from somewhere around $31 to $32 per ton up to the current level, which is $38.24 per ton. That is our permitting fees, it's our Title V fees, those types of things. The federal presumptive fee is somewhere between $45 and probably $46 per ton now. I haven't looked at it recently, but that's where it was last year. So we're still less than the federal presumptive fee. We've been able to maintain our operations with the existing revenue stream that you can see highlighted by these lines. That's the light blue line that goes up and down. That's what we collect from fees. That's a function of the number of fee payers, the emissions that are associated with that, oftentimes directly tied to the economy as to how things are going. The dark blue line is the general trend line. And there is a slight, that's not a surprise to folks, there is a slight dip in revenues. It is trending down. That is something that we've anticipated, which is why we've held our fee level at the same level, and we have not increased our operations. We roughly collect $3.7 to $3.8 million in fees. We have a $4.5 million appropriation. Since 2009, we have not collected revenue that is equivalent to our appropriation. If we were to do that, the fees would be roughly $50 per ton. So that's something that we haven't done through 2009, we're not anticipating doing. 2 sessions ago, we tried to reduce our appropriation, tried to shrink it by $500,000, and at the end of and increase our general fund appropriation. So what happened at the end of the legislative session, the legislature increased our fee appropriation instead of decreased it. And so that is something that we haven't used, we don't anticipate using, and we will most likely go back to the legislature, the budget subcommittee, and have a decision package that seeks to reduce some of our appropriation to more closely align the appropriation with the revenue. So where we need to be as a program, looking currently, and where we need to go in the future, is roughly, if I were to assign a number to it, it'd be about $4.2 million in a fee appropriation. And then we got to figure out how to fund it. We're not always going to go to existing sources that then subsidize new sources. We have to talk about application fees. And in the past, a lot of the larger sources have subsidized some of the smaller sources. So in this group, that's where we're going to come to this group in the future, and continue coming to this group, and talk about how we fund our programs, and what fees we collect, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's some of the refineries or some of the gravel crutchers, those types of operations. But before I come to you and say, okay, we need to increase fees, I want you to understand that we're running the most efficient program, the most effective program possible. Therein lies some of the registration programs. We can implement these programs with far fewer resources and obtain a greater air quality benefit, certainly a benefit that's commensurate with the resources that are expended. We're going to try to get additional registration programs. And then we will figure out how to fund those registration programs in a way that's sustainable moving forward. And we fully recognize that we probably peaked out as a program at 51 FTE 5 to 7 years ago. We're down around 44 to 45 FTE right now. And any vacancy we have, we're really looking at it to see, do we need it? Where do we need it? How do we fund it? How do we do this sustainable moving forward? And that we're recognizing that resources are going to be very hard to come by in the next 3 to 5 years. So long story short, it was a great question. I think we're on very solid financial footing because we've been very strategic. We've been very, I believe, fiscally responsible in how we spend this money. We've been trying to align our programs to be more effective, more efficient at what we do so that we don't always need to have a whole bunch of staff to implement program or obtain our air quality goals. And then moving forward, some of the problems that we're going to encounter in the future, dealing with people, dealing with pollution, whether it's forest fires, whether it's ozone, those are not things that are typically that we would get the emission fees from, because those are not things that are associated with the typical sources that we regulate. And we've got to figure out how to fund our operations in managing air quality from those types of sources moving forward, which may be more a combination of federal grant, general fund type stuff. So again, I thought this was a great opportunity to revisit some concepts that have been in front of CAAAC for some time, maybe some new concepts. We're going to be briefing the board here in a month, and we're not going to be increasing, we're not going to propose an increase to our fees, but we plan on giving them a very similar conversation that we're still managing, we're still morphing some of our programs to be more efficient, more effective, and that to stay tuned, we're going to work through CAAAC, and we're going to come back with some fee system into the future that may be more equitable and more sustainable moving forward. So I will be quiet there, and maybe it would be good to go to the phone first. If there's anybody on the phone that may have questions, comments, or concerns before we look around the room. Excellent. Any comments, questions? Anybody in the room? Great. Thank you.
Nice that Dave left you speechless. It's fantastic. Right? He always leaves you speechless. Like Dave mentioned, the Board of Environmental Review, it's kind of been in limbo since legislative session, but it's starting to stabilize. We do have one. If you didn't get that message, it's still in existence. And we have heard that the governor appointed some members. So let's see. Here we go. So this is our list of new board members. And I will just run through them for the people that are on the phone that can't see. He appointed 6 new, and we have 1 who is currently serving, has been serving. So Dexter Busby, somebody who's familiar with at our CAAAC meetings. John Diarmont, Christine Dabini, hoping that I say that right. John Felton, Hillary Hansen, Chris Tweeten, he's our existing member, and Tim Warner. If you guys have any questions about who they are, we know a little bit, but not much more beyond this. And we will have our first meeting September 29th with that new board. So our August 4th meeting did get canceled. There wasn't a quorum because nobody had been appointed. So we were just moving what we had told you was going to be at the August 4th meeting to the September 29th meeting. In addition to those couple of items, the 2016 IBR and the 2017 QAP will also do the fee update that Dave just mentioned. And again, our message is going to be that we're not increasing fees, that we don't see an increase in fees yet. And of course, that we go before our stakeholders before we did such a thing. I think that is it. Next, we're going to have Kristen Martin, our meteorologist.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the wildfire season. It's been a crazy wildfire season so far. We've already surpassed the last 4 years in acres burned in Montana alone. Just 2012 had more in the last 5 years. We've had a giant fire out in eastern Montana ecological complex, as well as significant fire activity in west central Montana around Missoula and the Bitterroot Valley area. And so one example here in Hamilton, so you can see this black line is our national ambient air quality standard. So since August 1st, we've had all but 4 days are above that line. And just to remind you guys, while these impacts still are affecting people's public health, when it is due to wildfires, they get removed from our regulatory. Sorry. When data is above 35, we do remove that through our exceptional events rule from counting against us regulatorily. So we do a demonstration saying, these are wildfires, we don't have any control over them, and so they don't hurt us regulatorily, but we certainly make a big effort to help protect people's public health, coordinating with the counties as well as the Forest Service to deploy temporary monitors to figure out where these impacts are. We've got, I think, 13 or 14 temporary monitors out there between us and the Forest Service so far, so we're really trying to capture where these impacts are occurring and hopefully send people to some cleaner air at times. And the kind of big story, at least for me, is if you notice here, the scale here is going from 0 to 60, and that ambient air quality standard is 35. Here is Seeley Lake. Since August 1st, we've had 24-hour averages above 300. We've had hourly concentrations above 900 some mornings. Almost every morning this past 2-week period, they've had smoke funneling down from the Rice Ridge fire, causing really exceptional air quality levels. And the Missoula County Health Department has recommended people leave the area at night due to these levels. And the other fire to note, the really massive lodgepole complex. Here's the satellite image from that fire after it burned. It burned 270,000 acres very quickly in a very devastating fire over in eastern Montana. So, any questions? It's not looking like it's going to get better anytime soon. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to assume that nobody needs a break since we're only 20 minutes in. Hopefully not. But if you do, let me know. Feel free to take a break whenever. Also, I don't intend that this part of the presentation will take until 4 o'clock, so don't worry about that. We'll probably be out of here early. So, moving on to regional haze. I feel like maybe a few of you are here because you're interested in hearing about regional haze. I will hopefully answer most of your questions, but just as a little caveat, this is a really complex topic. There are lots of little rabbit holes we could go down into. For today's presentation, I'm going to try to give you a few examples of things we've learned about regional haze while preparing a progress report on the program, and trying to keep it at a pretty high level while giving you some detail. Obviously, if you have questions, just feel free to ask them at any point during the presentation. You can ask them to me after the presentation, after the CAAAC meeting, by email, by phone. I did leave a few of my cards up front, and then I have my contact information at the end of the presentation for those of you who are watching the slides. So, what I hope to do today is start with a little review. I think there might be a few people who are new to regional haze joining us today, so I just want to give you an overview of what it is. Again, that'll be really quick. We'll then go into a little bit of a timeline so we can talk about what the process looks like and where we are in that process currently. We'll then get into some of those current visibility trends. So that's a little bit more of the detail that I think some people are going to be pretty interested in learning about. And really, the presentation is going to be kind of split into 2 pieces. So there'll be the first piece that is the review and overview of the process, and then we'll talk about the details. Just to start, what is regional haze? Haze is really visibility impairment. So you'll hear me talk about either haze, visibility impairment. I might go back and forth between those 2 terms. And what that means is that it's any humanly perceptible difference in visibility from what would be naturally occurring. And that haze is caused by tiny particles in the air that affect the way the light reaches our eyes. Those particles, of course, come from a variety of different sources. So those include vehicle emissions, large industry, small industry, wildfires, prescribed fires, and dust. And regional haze, a really important note on that is it's the cumulative impacts from a lot of different sources over wide geographic areas. So individually, what that means is that a source might not have a perceptible impact on haze just coming from one source, but we're really talking about lots of tiny particles coming from lots of little sources, all adding together and mixing in the air and causing haze. Those particles come in all sorts of different types as well. So here you'll see the different colors that will come up later in some graphs. I'm not saying that soil is orange, that's what EPA has assigned to it. And so just of note here for future graphs, you'll see if we look on, I guess it's on your right, on the side of the slide, sulfates and nitrates in yellow and red. Those are what we typically consider to be anthropogenic or man-made contributions to haze. So those are typically coming from our industrial sources and our mobile sources. If you look at down at the bottom, the organic carbon, elemental carbon, those are what we usually see coming from smoke impacts. So whether that's wildfire or prescribed fire, those two are generally associated with smoke. Just to keep that in mind for later as we go through. Haze particles have to be measured somewhere. So we measure them at a network of federally operated monitoring sites across the state, across the country, in fact. This right here is a picture of the monitoring site at Gates of the Mountains, just north of Helena here. And you can see the intakes at the top for 4 monitors that measure the different types of particles. Once those particles are measured in the monitors, the measured concentrations of each then are put into a formula to estimate what's called the light extinction. And what that means is it's the amount of light that's lost as it travels through the distance to our eyes. So when more light is lost as it travels, things appear hazy and we just can't see as well or as far. So that's pretty much what light extinction means. So the more light extinction there is from a certain subset of particle, the hazier it is. There are a few other terms just to complicate things. This scale at the bottom might be a little small for some of you, but the first term to keep in mind is deciview. And that is really the main unit that EPA uses to talk about haziness or how far you can see. So 1 deciview of change represents something that is perceptible to the human eye. So if we go from, say, 10 deciviews to 11 deciviews, I, as a person looking out into the scenery, would be able to see a difference in haziness. And on this chart, you can see, if you want to look at it later in more detail, kind of how that corresponds to light extinction. And then the last...
Where would we be today on light extinction?
Today? Gosh, that is a really good question. We'll look at a couple examples from Glacier. I don't know, unfortunately, we don't have the data from
Would we go
current.
with the yellow or the red today?
My guess would be, this is entirely a guess, we are probably right in the yellow, but that is completely a guess. And we'll see the pictures in a few slides so you can kind of compare. Unfortunately, the improved monitoring data doesn't become available for about 1.5 years. So when I have lots of questions about how the smoke has been impacting it this year, I'm going to have to wait for quite a while before I can figure that out. But at the very bottom, one thing that might be helpful is what's called visual range. And what that is a translation for most of us who don't want to talk about deciviews and light extinction and inverse megameters and those sorts of things. We can talk about visual range, which is expressed in kilometers here. But that really tells you an approximation of how far you can see. So where a high level of light extinction or high deciviews means lots of haze, a high visual range means not very much haze. We can see really far into the distance. And like I said, I do have a slide coming up in just a little bit where we'll look at some pictures so you can kind of see the difference from the same webcam. In planning to protect visibility across the country, the Clean Air Act specifically calls out some of our most scenic places. And these are called mandatory federal class 1 areas. So when we talk about monitoring for haze, we're really talking about a specific set of areas. These are things like our national parks, of course, wilderness areas, there's a picture of the scapegoat up there, and then also some wildlife refuges. And these are areas that were in place at the time of the 1970 Clean Air Act. And basically these are our most scenic places. There are areas we value for their views, and really they're places that we just don't want to have obscured by haze. In Montana, EPA specified 12 of these areas. Obviously Yellowstone National Park is only partially in Montana. And then there are also 3 in neighboring states that EPA has said are impacted by emissions from Montana. So you can see those, Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and then the 2 wilderness areas just south of our state in Wyoming. When we talk about regional haze, as I said, we're specifically talking about visibility in these Class 1 areas, but obviously cleaning up something that is a regional haze will benefit a wide variety of regions outside of just these areas. So if we're looking at monitoring haze in, say, the Anaconda-Pintler Wilderness, it's really indicative of what the haze is like in a much broader region than just inside those borders. Okay, I want to transition a little bit into the timeline, and we'll just start with 1999. I'm not going to go all the way back to the Clean Air Act at this point. So in 1999 is when we saw the Regional Haze Rule, which was published by EPA, and that is really what directed states to draft state implementation plans to control haze and clean up haze. It had 2 different goals, actually. It had the goal of cleaning up haze on some of the worst visibility days, so just the days that are completely hazy. We want to make sure that those are getting better. But then also EPA was looking at the days that are very clear and wanted to make sure that we're not seeing any degradation on those days. So our clearest, crispest days are staying just as crisp as they always have been. In 2006, for a variety of different reasons, Montana actually let EPA know that we were not going to be submitting a state implementation plan to address regional haze. That was in part for funding reasons, staffing reasons. It just wasn't a good time for Montana to take on such a large program. So we sent that back to EPA, and what that did was trigger EPA to prepare a federal implementation plan to address haze in Montana. And that, another word for that is FIP. So if you hear me talk about FIP, I'm referring to the Federal Implementation Plan, which was published in 2012. And what that did was it included some emission limits for a variety of the large emission sources in Montana. It included some emission limits for several coal-fired power plants, and then also a couple of our cement plants. We've seen a lot of activity in regional haze just in the last couple of years. In 2016, Governor Bullock published his blueprint for Montana's energy future. And what that did was it directed DEQ, along with the governor's office, to take back regional haze. So what that means is Governor Bullock really wants the state to be in the driver's seat for regional haze moving forward, and make sure that we're in control of how we're controlling our emission units in the state. As a result of that blueprint directive, DEQ formed a project team, and this was about last June. We've had a team together for over a year now, so we've been working on addressing regional haze, learning about regional haze. It's been a pretty steep learning curve for us, but I think we're getting there, so that's the result of this project team and the blueprint. In 2017, earlier this year, EPA finalized revisions to the regional haze rule. So that's the rule that was published originally in 1999. It has now been updated. Some of those revisions were intended to change the due date for the next implementation plan, and then also to better address emissions or sources of haze that are outside of the control of states. And so those are things like Kristen was talking about with wildfire smoke, international emissions, things that we as Montana maybe can't decrease necessarily. EPA wanted to change the rule and allow us some flexibility to really address what we can control. We also started working with some of our bigger stakeholders this spring. We had some meetings with the sources that had emission limits in the original FIP, and this is all in preparation to take over the regional haze program and get Montana back in control. I mentioned that the due date for the next planning period has been pushed back. That is part of that final revision to the regional haze rule. We now have a SIP due, state implementation plan due in 2021, summer of 2021. What it didn't change is that the implementation period that will be covered by that SIP is still 2018 to 2028. So it's a little bit weird in the timing that, you know, it will be for a period that starts in 2018 and then the plan won't be due for another 3 years after that. But that's what we're looking at currently. And then of course, once we take back the regional haze program, it is a long-term program, so we'll be in the driver's seat in charge of this program into the future. This is where we are now. We are in 2017 and we are currently looking toward that next implementation plan that's due in 2021. We've been really busy over the last year, as I mentioned, with our project team. And what we've been working on is a draft progress report. So in preparation to submit a SIP by 2021, we wanted to get familiar with the regional haze program and how it has been applied in Montana. And to do that, we told EPA that we were willing to prepare a progress report, which basically is looking at the progress that has been made improving visibility since the time that the FIP was published. So since 2012, how have those controls been implemented and has visibility improved as a result? We currently have a complete draft progress report. Some of you may have received an email from us letting you know that the public comment period just opened on Friday for this draft progress report. We've been working with the federal land managers because they are the ones who are really in charge of controlling, managing the air and the resources in those Class 1 areas. But the progress report is currently posted on our website for public comment. That public comment period is open through September 22nd, so a little bit more than a month from today. Send your comments in to me. You can always give me a call if you have questions on that, but feel free to take a look at it. It's a really long document, so I apologize for that, but enjoy. It has a lot of detail in it. Does anyone have any questions on this part of the presentation, or where we've been?
To answer Gary's question, I asked Kristen Martin, our meteorologist, and so do you want to go back to that? Is that okay? Maybe. Is it okay to do that? Maybe. Okay. So we can just see that the bar. There you go. So she said earlier today, it was 4 miles was the visual range, 700 light extinction, so yep, down in the red, and 42 deaths of use. So that's where we were at earlier today.
So where is it, I guess, then if it's in the red, where does it become a human health hazard where it really impacts human health, those with allergies? It's not Haze.
Mm-hmm. So we're,
Well,
yeah.
Haze is the particles, right?
Yep.
Okay, if it's particles, it could impact health.
It could, yep. So
I mean, it could impact your eyes. I mean, those
right.
You're introducing a substance into your your respiratory system and your eyes. So where does it impact? If it's over the red, where does it impact human health?
I think
Debbie and I got into this one at a time.
Oh, I don't even remember.
Gary and I have made amends since then. Right, Gary?
Yeah, we're okay.
We're okay.
I think you bring up a really important point, and I think, Alan, you got to it a little bit, but the Regional Haze program specifically focuses on what we can see. It is less focused on the human health impact, but the point is that as we clean up particles from the air, we are also doing something good for people's health. So those colors and the colors you see on a website like Today's Air, where you see the dots around the state, they don't exactly correspond. So when we talk about regional haze, we're really just looking at how far we can see.
Would it be fair, Rebecca, for those on the phone, this is Dave Clem, generally speaking, if we were to use 35 micrograms of PM2.5 as the threshold for the health, even though people experience health concerns below 35, I would bet the visual range would be somewhere around 10 to 15. when we start to see impacts above 35. So, you know, the health implications occur long before, to the left of,
Yes,
the left
yeah,
of the
that's
orange.
definitely fair to say. Yeah.
And just one more side note, Kristen again said that we are currently more about right about 34 decibels. So earlier today we were in the red, now we're looking more in the yellow. That's what I said. Yellow.
Yeah, which if you look at today's air, we're probably 35 to 40 right now on today's air, roughly.
That might be something that we can look into more and just have a better idea when we do present on this topic in the future of trying to correlate between the two. Because I think, you know, obviously as the Air Quality Bureau, we're working with both of those different concerns. So it would be nice to be able to tell people how they translate from one to the other. Thanks for that point.
Well, and not to speak for DEQ, but Alan, your point, I mean, one of the reasons why DEQ gave up the program back in 2006 was because it was not a human health program.
Debbie's done that more than once.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, we'll just move on. As a quick recap, we just sort of reviewed really quickly the history of regional haze, how we got where we are today, and now I really wanted to move into talking about some of what we learned as we were preparing the progress report. What I said earlier, we learned a lot. That's really true. We've really only shared kind of the tip of the iceberg with CAAAC so far. So this last part of the presentation will really focus on where we currently sit with the different visibility trends. And as I said at the beginning, I just want to reiterate, it's really complex. So I'm just going to touch on a few examples in this presentation. But obviously, if you have more questions, we have a ton more data than is in this presentation. And so I can certainly go back and answer all of your questions for you. Okay. So really what I want to try to do today is answer 3 different questions. I want to look at what is the current state of visibility in Montana? Are we making progress on visibility? And what is contributing to haze in Montana? And to do that, I really want to focus on 3 different examples from around the state. We're going to start with Glacier National Park, move to the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and then end with Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge out in eastern Montana. And so I'm going to, with each of these examples, talk about different pieces of the puzzle. So I'm not going to repeat the same information with each one. It will change a little bit. We'll start with Glacier. I think you all know where Glacier National Park is. I just want to point out on this slide, you can see this dark red dot. That is the location of the improved monitoring site. So that's where we're measuring the haze. And what this graph is showing you is a 5-year average visibility from the baseline period of 2000 to 2004 to the current visibility period, which is considered 2011 to 2015. And this is looking at deciviews again. So it's really good that we're seeing the deciviews decrease. That means that visibility is getting better in Glacier overall. The other thing I need to point out on this graph is it's looking at the 20% worst days. And what that means is the 20% of days that are monitored throughout the year that are the haziest. So it's about 24 days. The improved monitors measure every 3 days, and provided that that data is all complete and can be quality assured, you then multiply that by 20% and we get about 24 days in the year that are considered the haziest. Yeah, question?
Okay, we saw where Glacier's located in the
Yep.
northwest corner of the state. What are the contributing factors to regional haze there? What do you consider
I'll get to
most
that.
significant?
Sure, I'll get to that. We have a graph coming right up. So I'll just jump to, this is the haziest days, 20% worst. And then on the 20% best days, we're also seeing an improvement in visibility. And this is something we're seeing across the state on our clearest days. Those have actually, none of them have gotten worse, they have all improved. And so just for comparison between the best days and the worst days, you can see here we're at about 5.5 deciviews on our best, clearest days. And on that last graph, we're sitting around 17 deciviews on those worst days in Glacier. So the graph is still coming, I promise. It's coming right up. What does that really look like? These are the pictures. Fortunately, the improved monitoring network, they've put together some pictures from webcams where they've correlated photos from a day with the actual visibility for that day. And so in this first picture, what you're seeing is about our baseline for the worst days. So that's 22 deciviews and about 27 miles of visual range. And that is about where we were for that 2000 to 2004 period in Glacier. We're currently sitting around 17 deciviews for those worst days again. That corresponds to a visual range of about 44 miles. And where we're going on the worst days is we're headed toward about 9 deciviews of visibility, and that's about 99 or 100 miles of visual range. So you can still see in that last picture that there is a little haziness, and that's because this is still talking about the worst days. So for those clearest days, where we're sitting at 5.5 deciviews, it would be much clearer than that even. Okay, here's your graph where we talk about what's contributing to haze and Glacier. What we're seeing on this graph, you might recognize the colors from the particles that I showed earlier. We're looking at the different particle species in different colors. And then we're also looking at the contribution of each species to light extinction. So the bigger the bar of color, the more that specific type of particle is contributing to light extinction. And so just as a reminder, the higher number means stopping more light. A couple notes here. You can see there are a few years that are missing, and I mentioned really briefly earlier there are some issues with data completeness at some of the monitoring sites. These sites are very remote. Some of them are really difficult to access in certain seasons. So that has been an issue that we are in discussions with EPA. The other things you'll see on this graph, if you can note the yellow and the red at the bottom. As I said earlier, that's what we usually consider the anthropogenic impact on haze. And so you can see that that's pretty low in comparison to the actual size of the entire bar. And what you're seeing a lot of on this graph is green, which is the organic carbon contribution. And what that's primarily coming from is smoke. And in Glacier, it's primarily wildfire smoke. So that's what we're seeing at many of our western sites. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next example because it shows it even more. So for that, I just want to go to the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And so just a note on this one, I am calling this Bob Marshall Wilderness, but you can see there is one monitoring station down here at Montour Creek. And that monitoring station is representative of the Scapegoat Wilderness, Bob Marshall Wilderness, and the Mission Mountains. So we actually only have 8 monitoring sites in Montana that represent the 12 Class 1 areas, just as a side note. At this monitoring site, we have not seen improvement on the worst days. So unlike at Glacier where we saw the deciviews decreasing, here we actually saw a slight increase. This is more typical of what we see at sites across western Montana. And I will get into why that is in just a second. But first, it's a preview. We've seen a significant improvement on the clearest days, even at this site where we are not improving the worst days. And as I said earlier, we've actually seen this at every single one of those 8 monitoring sites across the state, is improvement on the best days. So getting back to similar looking graph, what you can see on this one is the impact of bad fire years. So you see really 2007, 12, and 15, really extreme contributions from organic carbon. And those, anyone who lives in this area knows that those were incredibly bad fire years. There was a ton of smoke, and the monitor picked it up, not surprisingly. So given the extremely high peaks in the wildfire years, you can see on this graph that this anthropogenic contribution is really squished down at the bottom. What is important to note, though, is that it's still there. We do still see, especially here, some sulfate contribution. And so what that suggests to us is that there are man-made contributions to haze, even at a site that has such high impact from wildfire smoke. And so that's where we really need to focus our attention, is trying to figure out how do we shrink this contribution down even further. And so with lots of these peaks in the later years and none of the peaks in the earlier years, you can kind of start to see why maybe between the baseline period and the current period, we are not seeing an improvement on those worst days. So this graph, again, just in case I didn't mention it, is the worst days. So it would look entirely different if we were looking at a graph of the best days and the contributions to Haze on the best days.
Rebecca, you classified industrial contributions to those bottom two. What are the industrial classifications that would contribute to those numbers on the bottom versus automobiles or wood smoke, from?
Sure,
Do you
yeah.
consider wood smoke, smoke from a fireplace or a wood stove in a house, is that anthropogenic or is that?
That's a tough one to answer because that would show up on here as being the organic carbon contribution. So that would show up just like smoke. And that's something that we'll be struggling with and we'll be having conversations with EPA about is in this next planning period, we're supposedly going to be able to kind of put aside the impacts from wildfire smoke and consider those natural, but how do we separate that type of smoke from?
I guess, the reason I asked the question, both Wildfire Wilderness and Glacier Park would seem to be away from industrial areas that would contribute a lot of those bottom two.
Yeah, sure, and I can go back to that. Yeah, and that's absolutely right, you're correct on that. And you can tell in this graph, let's see if I can get my mouse, there it is. So you can see that these bars are up around 100 for light extinction, but really the contribution from these, what we consider anthropogenic sources, are down below 10. So that is a really low contribution from those sources. In our next example, you'll see a site that has a significantly higher contribution from man-made sources. And so the way this all works, when we look at what sources are actually contributing, and so industrial classifications, there will be some regional modeling that's done. So our regional organization is Westar, and they also work with the Western Regional Air Partnership, RAP, and they'll be doing modeling based on emission inventories from all of the states in the Western region, including even into Canada and out into the ocean, into Mexico a little bit. And so we do source apportionment from that modeling.
So some of the industrial applications, I guess, could be coming from Washington State and Idaho.
Yeah.
Air goes from west to east, some of that Wisconsin British showing up from a different state.
Exactly. And so we do have a website where we can pull graphs that just show that modeling, the results of the modeling, and it shows it based on the type of industrial contribution and then also the location that it is coming from. And so at a site like Glacier, for example, we see a lot of what's considered to be mobile source emissions coming from Canada, in fact. And we see mobile source emissions contributing to the nitrates across the state. But yes, we do have that information as well. Okay, so back to this graph. This was just going back to the graph we looked at earlier. Ideally, we don't want to see this going up. We would like to see this graph going down. But this graph is just showing you the 5-year averages for 2 periods. And it's really not telling the whole story. If we graph this by the average decibels for each year, you can really see the impact of those high wildfire years. And you can get a better sense of where the trend is on the worst, haziest days in years that are not wildfire years. And so what you're seeing here is decibels again, and these little dots are the averages for the year. And what this light green line is showing you is actually starting from the baseline, projecting out to the year 2064, which is when, according to EPA, we're supposed to meet our natural goal. So when we looked at the pictures of Glacier, that's where we should hit, I think it was 9 decibels by 2064. And so you can see, with the exception of these wildfire years, we're really trending right along that line. And so that is part of one of the conclusions that we've submitted or will submit in our progress report to EPA, is just showing the impact of the overwhelming impact, I would say, of wildfire smoke on our western sites. This is not just Montana who's dealing with this. When we talk to the other states in the western region, we hear from almost all of them that they have these same issues with wildfire smoke. And that is part of the reason that the regional haze rule was revised earlier this year, is EPA did listen to western state concerns. And so they're trying to help us to better address those wildfire impacts. And, you know, obviously that doesn't take away the smoke. It doesn't take away the fact that if a visitor comes to Montana and goes to Glacier in the summer, it's probably going to be smoky and they're not going to have a great view. But really what we need to focus on is the impacts that we can do something about. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to show progress without those wildfire impacts that we can't control. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so where's my mouse? Our next site is pretty completely different from the first two. We're going to go all the way up to northeastern Montana and look at Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge. So you can see it's right outside, kind of right between the Fort Peck Reservation, North Dakota border, and the Canadian border. And this is kind of a funny graph because we've barely moved on those worst days. We went from a value of 17.7 decibels in the baseline to 17.9. But just like everywhere else, we did see improvement on the best days. So I mentioned earlier that I would come back to looking at the anthropogenic impacts in a later example, and this graph really shows you why that is. So if you remember on the previous graphs, you saw kind of a tiny bit of red and yellow at the bottom, predominantly green bars. You can see on this graph that there are much larger proportions of sulfates and nitrates at the Medicine Lake monitoring site. And they're really not just proportionally bigger, they're actually larger concentrations of those anthropogenic contributions. So this slide has a lot going on, but these are just the graphs that we've already looked at. And so you can see Glacier National Park, Bob Marshall Wilderness, and then Medicine Lake, all with the same scale. So they all are going up to 120 in light extinction now. And that's where you can really see the size of these red and yellow bars at Medicine Lake is completely different from what we see in western sites. The other thing you don't see on Medicine Lake is the highly variable year-to-year impact from wildfires. So with the exception of 2015, things are really more consistent from year to year at Medicine Lake. What you don't see very well with this type of graph is a trend. There are lots of colors, lots of things going on here. But if we just look at the trends, this is just looking at sulfate contribution to light extinction in the baseline period and then the current period, again on those worst days. And you can see that the contribution from sulfates is trending down. So that is really positive, that's what we want to see. You know, we talked about how we can't address some of the natural contribution from wildfire smoke. We can address contribution from emissions, and what it looks like to us is that we are doing a good job of addressing those emissions. The same is true for nitrate contribution at Medicine Lake. That has also been trending downward. And actually, we saw this trend in both sulfates and nitrates at almost every site across the state. There were only two sites, Sula Peak was one where we saw, we did not see improvement in these two on the worst days. And then Medicine Lake, actually, we saw nitrates going up on the best days. So there were only two examples from, if you think about it, really 16. If we look at 8 sites, worst days, best days, only 2 of those where we didn't see decreasing nitrate and sulfate. So our conclusion in the progress report is we're doing a great job. We're trending downward on these anthropogenic contributions. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Was that as a result of enforcement action by the BDR or as a result of voluntary contributions by industry?
What do you think? That's a really hard question to answer.
You're telling me that.
BDR doesn't do enforcement actions. No. They listen if people challenge our enforcement.
Okay.
You know,
so then
actions, they would sit
are
and
the
judge.
Downward trends a result of enforcement action by the DEQ, Rebecca, or your division, Dave, or is that industry's contribution is going down?
Go ahead.
I would say it is a combination of multiple factors. I think there have been a lot of regulations coming out from, not from Regional Haze and not from the state of Montana, just additional regulation that has caused emissions to be trending down in all industries. We've also seen some shutdowns, of course, across the state, so that definitely contributed.
Shutdowns of what? Tell me, shutdowns of what?
Sure. For example, we saw Corette. Corette is no longer operating.
Could you show me an example of Corette, how it affects northeastern Montana? Because I got my doubts on that one.
You know, if you're gonna depose her, I think you gotta put her in.
Maybe UL Bend would have it, but Corette would, I got my doubts if it would affect Madison.
Right. Yeah, I do too. I think getting back to the fact that we're talking about really tiny contributions from lots of different sources, it's really hard to put a finger on, okay, this source went down or this source installed controls, here's how it has affected it.
So when I ask that question, is the downward trend result of enforcement action? It's maybe.
Yep.
Well, and you know what, this is where, you know, enforcement action to me means something. It has regulatory baggage. What we have are programs that are out there to protect air quality. Sometimes there are emission reductions associated with those programs. There are times, like you mentioned, that industry does put on control that isn't required. And they reduce their emissions. They reduce their actual emissions, even though their allowable emissions stay the same. So what you're going to be looking at is actual emissions in the state are trending down for a variety of reasons. And yes, we do have an enforcement component for folks that are in non-compliance or significant non-compliance. And there was also some regulatory programs that drive those down, as well as the economy and other factors. But yeah, the emissions are trending down, which is a good thing. Back to the fees, that's a bad thing. We don't collect as much fees, right? So that's why we need to disconnect there or decouple. So it's I don't know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, I don't know that there's an exact answer to your very good question. It would be nice to know precisely what caused that so that we could repeat it. But I think this is a multivariable equation that changes from
Well,
year
the
to
reason I
year.
asked it, Dave, was because when you're talking Medicine Lake, you're talking something well out of the realm of industrial pollution from, you know, sources that I see. So that's why I asked.
Seemingly.
Industrial sources up there that would cause that.
Yeah.
Shut down those industrial sources.
And we got a neighbor to the north of us too that, you know, that does tend to impact a large
I
swath of
understand
this.
that you have power plants in Canada, you know, I
Lots of
understand
stuff
that.
up there. Yeah.
So that really gets us to the question.
Great question, though, Gary. I do like this. You gotta be an attorney, right? I mean, this.
Oh, I learned everything I know.
Well, you deposed her the same way. You didn't put either one of them under oath.
Everything I know. We had a long discussion one day and she taught me everything I know.
Okay, Gary, now you're scaring me.
I think the bottom line to answer that question and going forward on the question of did we make any progress is it's really difficult to answer that question. And that is because it really depends on how you look at it. So as I talked about, we did improve visibility on the best days. And partly that is because without the large wildfire impacts on those days, they're a lot more affected by man-made particles. And so even the small reductions in the anthropogenic the contribution that we did see, those would have an improvement on visibility on those best days because it's not being obscured by the wildfire smoke. And then as I just mentioned, we did decrease the anthropogenic contributions at almost all of the sites since the baseline period. But we haven't met our goals on the haziest days, with the exception of 2 of the sites, which are Glacier National Park and the UL Bend National Wildlife Refuge, which I'll get to a point on that just in a second. In western Montana, the reductions in anthropogenic emissions or contributions were really obscured by those humongous impacts from wildfire smoke. And then at Medicine Lake, what it looks like to us is that even though we did make improvement or reductions in man-made emissions, it just wasn't enough or it wasn't consistent enough year to year to show a total overall deciview reduction in haze on those worst days. So that results in us not meeting our goals for 2018. And there are a few reasons for that. The question really is why not? Why haven't we met our goals? And partly that's because of that wildfire smoke in western Montana. But then the other thing you'll see in the progress report is we talk about 3 different reasons that maybe we haven't quite reached our goals yet. The first of which is just that all of the emission reductions haven't happened yet. So in 2012, EPA published the Montana FIP. That's where those emission limits came in. If controls were required to be installed, those sources were allowed to have 5 years to install those controls. So from 2012 to 2017 now, that's 5 years. So we haven't installed and commissioned all of the controls that were prescribed in 2012 yet. So that means that maybe we haven't reduced emissions as much as was expected when that FIP was published. There are also things like at Colstrip units 1 and 2, the courts actually vacated those limits, sent them back to EPA, and those are still sitting on EPA's desk, kind of waiting to see what happens with those. So first reason why we haven't met our goals, maybe it's because we haven't installed all of the controls yet. So we're still going to see those emissions trending even further downward, hopefully. Second reason, I think Alan was laughing because he knew this was coming, oil and gas activity has changed significantly since the baseline period of 2000 to 2004. And when we look at it in eastern Montana, western North Dakota, sure, maybe the boom has dropped off a little bit, but how has that landscape changed from the oil and gas activity that is maybe still causing some impacts that we didn't anticipate when that FIP came out in 2012. We've also seen some recent modeling from the BLM that suggests maybe there are some modeled impacts from oil and gas in eastern Montana, western North Dakota. That's something we're still going to have to look into more. We don't have all the answers to this right now. We'll be doing our own modeling as well as part of our regional modeling effort. So we'll be looking into that a little bit more.
Rebecca, I think, and there again, and one of the things with oil and gas, our capture rate on gas emissions is sitting about 92% today. And that can have a big effect on that.
Yeah.
Over the years, our capture rate on gas has really increased, and that could lead to a big drop in emissions.
Right, but more wells, right?
More wells,
yeah.
But
not many more.
Well, not over the last several years.
Right.
No, but I think the key was since the 2000 to 2004 timeframe. That's the baseline.
Right.
There was not, I think we got most of those 460 some odd applications in a box around 2005-ish. And so, they weren't realized in that baseline period.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it was even higher then than it is now.
Yeah. Yep.
With the new wells.
Yep. Go ahead, Gary.
Rebecca, I'm going back to number 1 there. How do you work, because some of the emissions of anthropogenic emissions are coming from Canadian sources. How do you work with the Canadians across an international boundary? How do you, as a DEQ, ask the Canadians to help out?
That's number 3 on the list.
Yeah, that's a good question.
A.
Well, I just want to ask a question. 3 wasn't up there.
40% discount rate.
Remember that David Letterman, the Mr. Curious episode? I mean, Mr. Curious.
Maybe I'm not supposed
Excellent.
to ask questions.
No, I was looking for someone with the feed discussion. I really wanted a question.
We could go with that. We'd like it. We'd like to return to
I'm
that.
thinking we could call Rebecca Carmack.
Yeah, that's before a lot of Johnny Carson.
That before Rebecca's Johnny Carson.
Gary, I think to start to answer your question, our strategy has been we're going to put this in our progress report and we're going to talk about the fact that Canadian emissions are impacting our sites. And that's where we're going to start. And I don't know that I could just call up Canada and talk to them at the power plant.
Justin Trudeau, that's okay.
Yeah. We'll get him on the phone.
Gary Trudeau's brother, and then a good funky winker bean.
But we do have well-documented impacts from Canadian sources. Specifically, there is a power plant that sits at, I think it's just north of Scobie, right along the border. We have seen in our progress report, you can go through there and you'll see, we look at the wind, the direction the wind's coming from, and we look at the modeling that we did as a region back in the 2000 to 2004 period that really did show that there are impacts coming from Canada. And that's going to be something we'll hopefully be in conversation with EPA throughout the next planning for the next planning period, basically, to try to figure that out. Because what can we do, you know, as a state when those impacts are coming in from our northern border? So I think what that brings me to next is kind of our next steps. And so all of those three issues and then also the wildfire smoke, those are all things that we're going to be moving forward with us as we start to talk about putting together a state implementation plan for that next planning period, which is the 2018 to 2028 period. And so to get there, we're really staying closely involved with our region. We'll be doing providing some emission inventory information for regional modeling, source apportionment. So that will really give us a better idea of where the impacts are coming from, whether they are from sources in Montana, sources in neighboring states, neighboring countries. That will be where we get that information. And then what that will help us do is to identify sources or source categories that are impacting visibility at different sites around the state. And then once we know where those impacts are coming from, we really need to do an analysis at the state level of whether there are any reasonable controls that could be applied to those sources or source categories that would help us improve visibility at the sites they're impacting. So that's kind of, those are the steps to get us to that next state implementation plan. That's what we're going to be working on between now and 2021. We're going to be participating in the RAP as a region, talking to all of our other states in the region, and then of course talking to all of you intensively over the next few years about this as we move forward. Anyone have questions? That is the end of the presentation. So you can ask all the questions you have been saving. Does anybody on the phone have questions?
This is Beth Steinmetz with Northwestern Energy. I've got a question for you as far as the EPA plan, and it's removed BC1 from the list of regional haze sites. Is that something that for the state implementation plan, that will also be the case for the state of Montana as well?
That's a good question, Beth. Thank you for that. So for those who aren't aware, I think it was the Blaine County Compressor Station, Northwestern Energy Source, was included in that 2012 FIP as a site that needed controls. It was erroneously included, and so EPA has actually, they have a rule out that's proposed, expected to be final pretty shortly here, to remove that source from the control limits that were proposed, that were required in 2012. So as we move forward, Beth, I'm not sure. We can't say for sure that that site won't be included in the next round. We're going to be doing a full new analysis and trying to figure out where impacts are coming from. Is that
okay? Thank you.
Maybe not the answer you wanted, but.
Hey Beth, this is Debbie Skibisky. Since you guys have taken those engines out, BC1 isn't a major source anymore. It shouldn't. I would be really surprised if it ended up being subject to any of those types of requirements, given the emission status now.
Okay.
So it really shouldn't be. I would guess that the focus would be on larger sources. And when you looked even at the impacts with those engines in, it was a mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification, Debbie. I appreciate that.
So one other clarification on that, in the first round for the FIP, EPA was really specifically looking at what was called BART sources. So they had a specifically defined subset of source categories, and it was based on their age, their source category, and that was where they were really focused. So for the second round, BART doesn't come back. That was a one-time thing. we're only going to be looking at what are called reasonable progress sources. So that's where we really get into the analysis of whether the controls are considered reasonable. And that's something that we'll be working on internally, and then also obviously bringing in stakeholders to talk through how that process will look. Do you have something to do?
Which is also why, I mean, you're right, it may be unlikely, but you really can't eliminate anything because we don't know without the analysis, eliminate things for sure. The likelihood of something coming back on a smaller source, maybe not. But we have to wait and see for sure.
Is there a goal for when the modeling is going to be done? Do you have a goal for that, or a kind of an estimate on when, like, the final numbers will be in?
Right. They do, there is a timeline, I don't have that with me, but our regional organization has put out a draft timeline for that modeling. We're hoping that we can have our final numbers, I think it was spring of 2020. It's all gonna be starting up this fall and winter, and hopefully moving right along. We would prefer to get that information sooner rather than later, but it looks like we should have it spring 2020, around there.
Okay, thank you.
Will your slide presentation be available? Can I go to your website?
Yep.
The slide
Yep.
presentation?
It is currently posted on the CAAAC website.
Just to build on Jim's question, this is Dave Clem for those on the phone, the RAP. WRAP, Western Regional Air Partnership, is conducting that, and a bunch of states are pooling the resources, that is money, to fund a lot of that analysis so that it doesn't fall squarely on one state. A lot of them are the states in the West where most of the Class 1 areas are. And so we are hopeful to get some information out rather quickly so that we can start the analysis, but recognize there's 14 other states that may be competing for some of that early data as well.
Any other questions on the phone? If not, wanted to end with a reminder again that the progress report is posted on our public comment website. Anyone can go out, download it, read through it. I think it's about 95 pages, not including the appendices. We are having a public hearing for that, which is scheduled for September 11th. And then just prior to the hearing, starting just the hour before, we're going to have just an informal conversation about it. So if anyone does have questions that come up between now and then, feel free to either contact me or come to that informal Q&A before the hearing. With that, thank you. So we do, I don't know if Liz mentioned this earlier, but we have tentatively scheduled our next CAAAC meeting for November 16th. That's also a Thursday, and it'll be in the afternoon again. So we'll be in touch with more detail on that as we approach that date.